In today's video, I'm going to be making a whiskey cabinet. A whiskey cabinet with a tambour door. I'm very excited to try building a tambour door. I've never tried this before and honestly had thought of it as a little old school for my taste. But I don't know. Let me know down in the comments if you think this is more of a modern take on a tambour door or if I'm just crazy. To get this project underway, I needed to break down my lumber for the build. This walnut was from the tree I cut down from my kitchen table. I'll link that above. So to get this walnut ready, I need to cut the pieces to size, flatten them, and put straight edges on it before I can use it. But the cherry that I'll be using was already S4S lumber, so I didn't need to do anything to get that ready for this build. The case of the cabinet will be walnut and the door will be a mix of walnut and cherry. The back panel in the cabinet will be made of leftover walnut, which I had from resawing the walnut to thickness, but we will get back to this later. With the wood milled up, I needed to glue up some panels to make sure I had enough material to build this. This was one of these projects where I build a project to size based on how much material I had to work with. This one was cutting it very close, to be honest, but I was able to build this to the dimensions that I wanted, but I did not have any extra material in case something went wrong. And this was my first time ever building a tambour door, so what could possibly go wrong? Let's get started by building the back panel or the back wall first. This was a bit of a difficult choice to make. I could have done many different things for this, but with the material that I had for this build, I decided to use the cutoffs from resawing the walnut to make a frame for some epoxy. The thought process behind this was to get a similar look to the bars that have glass mirrors behind their bottles on the shelf. I didn't want the mirror part exactly, but I wanted some shine and reflection, and something that wouldn't take away from the bottles in the cabinet. To continue the trend of cutting things close on this build, I had very little epoxy left to make this possible, and the epoxy calculator on Mass Epoxy's website was a lifesaver. Now that I knew exactly how much epoxy I needed, I could begin pouring the epoxy and mixing it up. I decided to go with black epoxy because black epoxy and walnut are like a cheeseburger and fries. You can't have one without the other. And I wanted to add a little bit of gold, just a little bit, to match the brass handles that I'll put on the door later. Let's just say the little bit of gold epoxy turned into a lot of gold epoxy. So I did my best to create an abstract design in the epoxy as it cured, trying to make the gold disappear into the black. Next, I spent lots of time making a paperclip shape that will help me make the groove for the doors. The space had to be big enough internally to hold all the bottles and glasses I planned to put inside this cabinet. Also, while making this, I had to take into consideration that the door itself would be 3/4 of an inch thick. I wanted this to be almost flush with the front of the cabinet. The sides also needed to be considered as well, so the door wouldn't rub against the sides when it's opened and closed. And last but not least, the back. I needed to leave room for an inset French cleat, a space for the door when sliding open, and the back panel in front of the door when it was open to hide it. Lots of thought went into making this shape before I used the router and a bushing to route out the groove for the door. Now let's get to the most exciting part of this build, the tambour door. This is by far the most time-consuming part of the build, minus milling the lumber. I started this process with one long panel glued up with cherry and walnut. Next, I ripped the panel into 1-inch strips. I had blue tape across the panel to keep my pieces in order because I wanted the continuous grain pattern to show on the door. I can't remember how many strips I cut, maybe around 40, but what I do remember is that it was freezing in my unheated workshop, and that I needed to keep taking breaks so I could feel my fingers again. Once all the pieces were cut at 90 degrees, I did a few test cuts to figure out what kind of chamfer I wanted to put on the pieces to give the door a bit of character. Once I found the angle I was looking for, it was time to make around 80 passes through the table saw to get the chamfer on each side. The blue tape on the pieces also ensured that I cut the angle on the correct side of the door. That would be pretty bad if I had everything cut right and then one piece was cut backwards so the grain no longer matched up. And after all of that cutting in the freezing cold temperatures, how could it get any worse? Hold my beer or hot chocolate, said my sander, because now I have to sand all the pieces. And not just the front and back with the orbital sander, but also each chamfer. And oh yes, I had to do those by hand. So let's just say I got hand cramps and frostbite in the same day. What you see me sanding the pieces in is a jig that I need to glue the pieces together to make the door. But the jig also worked really well for helping me sand the fronts and the back at the same time, and not each piece individually. With the sanding done, I can now go inside and warm up. Next, I must dust off all the pieces and wipe them down with mineral spirits to remove any more dust, and then I let them dry. Once the mineral spirits has dried, I can finish all of the slats on all sides except the back. The back will be getting glued to the canvas to make the door. So to make sure the glue works correctly, it's best to have an unfinished surface to glue on. But all the other sides will be tough to finish once the pieces are glued together. So it's best for me to do it now, and I am using Rubio Monocoat to finish this project. When the finish was dry, I could begin the glue up for the door. To make the tambour door work correctly, we must have a canvas or some type of flexible material to the back of all the slats, like a leather or canvas. I'm going to be using a drop cloth canvas that I got from the big box store. This canvas has a thin layer of plastic on it, which I thought was a great idea for the glue up, so the glue didn't seep through and get on my hands as I roll the canvas flat to get all the air bubbles out of it. But this came back to bite me in more ways than one. I do not recommend the canvas with a plastic back. The orange tape you see around the outside of the door is the areas I don't want to get glue on. These parts will be running in the groove that I cut out with the router. The orange tape also helps create clean lines when it's time to trim the canvas down to size. And once the glue was curing for about an hour or so, this is the time that I needed to remove the door from the jig. I am doing this to make sure that the glue hasn't seeped between the slats and is gluing them together. Each piece of the door needs to move individually for the door to work correctly. I continued to check to make sure no pieces were glued together every 30 minutes or so for the next few hours. After a few days and the glue was completely dry, or so I thought it was dry, I began cutting the rabbets on the doors so that it would fit into the groove that I made with the router. This was honestly a lot of trial and error to get the doors to the right height with the sides, and to take into account the pre-cut grooves on the base and top of the cabinet for the doors. I kept having to make them shorter as I messed up a few times, but I finally got it correct, and they were still tall enough for the height of the whiskey bottles that I had. I wrapped the doors with paper when I ran them across the table saw to protect the pre-finished part of the doors already. At this point, I was honestly feeling pretty good with myself for what I had managed to build so far, but this didn't last long as I started to line everything up for a dry fit and organizing everything that I put inside. I realized something terribly wrong. This is a part I could easily skip over and no one would ever notice. The power of video editing, I guess I could say. But I figured I should share what issues I was dealing with, because if it's happening to me, it might happen to someone else. Not sure if you can see this yet, but as I'm testing everything out and sliding the doors, I'm noticing that it's not moving very smooth. Well, my door pieces have a massive inward bow to them, like 1/4 inch inward bow in the middle, and the material is just over a foot tall. Now I'm guessing it could be a few things. One, the glue isn't completely dry. This is why I'm not a fan of the plastic on the back of the canvas, because there's no air movement in and out with the plastic on the canvas. And two, the middle of my doors is a glue seam, where I attach 2 pieces of cherry together to make it wider, 2 5-inch pieces attached dead center to make it 10 inches wide. This is where the inward bow is happening, and at this point I was pretty upset. So I did everything I could to try to fix it, putting weight on the pieces in the opposite direction to push them back down, and I let it sit for a week or so. But during this week I pressed on and worked on other parts of the cabinet. The doors ended up flattening out in the end, but after about 1 month in the finished cabinet, the doors actually started to bow out ever so slightly. I think it stopped moving now, but I don't know what I did wrong, but I've never had wood movement take over a project like this before. During the week of the doors flattening out, I got the back epoxy panel cut to size, and it's starting to grow on me now, even if I messed up my color or ratio of black and gold. To hold the glasses and to continue the theme of the bar top with the mirror back, a lot of these places have bottles sitting on glass or clear shelves, so I wanted to make a glass shelf for my glasses to sit on. The glass would also keep this small space feeling more open and less cramped than if I had made this out of wood. The glass lets the light shine through the entire cabinet, which I thought was a nice touch. I also needed to add lights to the cabinet, so motion sensor lights with rechargeable batteries I picked out I think are perfect for this. And of course the light needs to be recessed in the top of the cabinet to make it look more seamless, so I use my router to make a groove for the lights to be inset into. With the lights and the glass shelf done, my vision for this whiskey cabinet is really starting to come to life, and once again I'm pleased with this project. To finish this project off, I had a few details to address. I rounded over the edges to follow the curvature of the door, added brass door pulls to open and close the doors. These door pulls also work as stops so the doors don't open too far and go behind the back panel. And finally, I attached the sides to the top using screws. I used screws because of all the trouble I was having with the doors, otherwise I would have just used glue. With screws, I can disassemble this and make a new door in the future if needed. I decided to cap the screw holes on the top of the cabinet with brass to keep the theme of the brass throughout the project going instead of using walnut plugs. And a final sanding on the cabinet box itself, and it's time for finish. And if you have watched any of my other videos, you best believe that I'm using Rubio Monocoat to finish this project. The ease of use and how it color pops walnut is just hard to beat in my opinion. After the finish dries, I can finally put all the pieces together and watch this Tambour whiskey cabinet come to life. My woodworking journey has always been about trying to learn something new on each project, and taking that journey of learning a new skill with open arms. But this project definitely had me questioning if I was going to be able to complete this successfully. I have never quit a project that I have started, but this one made me think twice. I think this is a good reminder for me that when the going gets tough, it's good to take a step back and take a breath. Take a break if possible too. Focus on the other parts of the goal, then come back and attack what is giving me fits. Sometimes good things just take time. Just like every good woodworking project, a lot of planning and time goes into making a successful project. Bumps along the road are inevitable, but how you step back and problem solve the issues show in the end result. One-of-a-kind masterpieces. The type of masterpieces that you can pour a glass for, stand back, and enjoy what you have just successfully completed. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next build.